Our guest is Neta Crawford, co-director of the Cost of War Project at Brown University, a political science professor at Boston University. Professor Crawford, your group has pegged the current total at $5.9 trillion. Before we get into how you came up with that number, remind us what overseas operations are included in the war on terror.
Well, the United States has obviously got still a large number of troops in Afghanistan. There are troops in Iraq, and there are forces fighting in about 80 to 90 other locations in the world. There's also spending that is used by the State Department in protecting its own embassies and other locations. So there's a lot of money in the war on terror that's sort of sprinkled out, but the major concentrations are in the war zones.
And when you talk about war spending, most people usually think of the cost of putting boots on the ground and putting planes in the sky. Of that $5.9 trillion that you've come up with, how much is made up of just that component?
Well, the Department of Defense overseas contingency operations, which is what they call it, is about $2.9 trillion.
So where does the rest of that $5.9 trillion come from? Walk us through the rest of the numbers there.
Right. Okay. So as I said, there is State Department spending. There's also spending on Homeland Security, which is associated with preventing and responding to potential terrorist attacks. There's money in the base military budget, which is used for instance, patrolling the skies when necessary of the homeland, and also increasing base security in the U.S., as well as increases in base military spending for things like TRICARE health expenses, and pay raises when necessary to recruit and keep troops who, at some points in these wars, it was very difficult to get people to come, and so they had to increase the bonuses and so on for enlistment. And then there's also interest on borrowing for these wars. And then as well, there's a large portion of the spending which is going towards caring for the veterans.
And talk about that last point, about $1 trillion you peg at future health care costs for veterans since September 11, 2001.
That's right. Well, the reason that healthcare expenses for veterans will be higher, I think essentially fall into two. One is there are a large number of these veterans. There's right now about 3 million post 9/11 veterans who've moved into the VA system. And they're relatively young compared to the other veteran populations, but in some cases they're sicker than the veterans of previous wars. They've done multiple deployments. They've carried around heavier packs. So they have musculoskeletal problems. They have higher rates of respiratory problem, cardiovascular issues, and then of course there are more than 300,000 people with traumatic brain injuries. In addition, there are people with major limb amputations and other problems associated with the war. Now I'm not even talking about PTSD, just other medical problems. So as those veterans age, their costs for care and the benefits for disability will increase.
War costs since 9/11-2001 is our topic for this segment of the Washington Journal. Our phone line split up a little bit differently this morning. Regional, if you're in the Eastern or Central time zones, 202-748-8001 is the number if you want to call in. If you're in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, we have a number for you as well. We also have a special line set aside for post 9/11 veterans. That's 202-748-8002. Especially want to hear from you in this 30-minute segment of the Washington Journal this morning. Neta Crawford is with the Cost of War Project. Can you explain to folks what that is and how long you've been trying to track the cost of war?
We began in 2010 with assembling a number of experts, about 24 experts, who looked at various elements of the response to the 9/11 attacks. And these people put together a series of reports which are on the Cost of War website that look at things from increased Homeland Security spending, as we've talked about, veterans care issues, consequences for civilians in the areas that the United States attacked following 9/11, and in many areas we found when we did this report we needed to know more. So over the last several years, what we've done is we've added the number of experts from universities and outside universities to cover things that we didn't cover in our original analysis. For instance, we began to look at the cost of health care for veterans by states. And we've also done some work on the environmental costs of these wars. And so we found when we began this work that we needed to just increase our purview so that we could get a more comprehensive understanding of the cost of these wars.
You peg it at $5.9 trillion. Explain why your numbers are so much different from the Pentagon. Through fiscal 2018, they peg the cost of wars since 9/11 at $1.7 trillion.
Well, the Pentagon is only counting what they've been appropriated for the major war zones, right? So we're looking at all the war zones. We're looking at the increases in the base military budget, and I said we're trying to be more comprehensive by understanding the domestic, the immediate domestic fiscal impact of increased military spending in terms of debt, and we're also trying to understand the costs of these wars in the long run.
And here's one headline stemming from your new report that came out. The cost of the 17-year war on terror could pay off a quarter of the national debt. That from the Daily Caller, their story last week after you released this latest report. We'll let you chat with callers as well. Phone lines split up regionally. We also have a special line for post 9/11 veterans. That special line 202-748-8002. But we'll start with Sean in Lakeland, Florida. Sean, go ahead. You're on with Professor Neta Crawford.
Yeah, how you doing? You're talking about spending, which kind of overlaps the medical from the last segment, and I don't know if a soldier's wife has insurance and they're able to use that also. And they say they have need a knee replaced, and this happened to me. Now the doctors for my MRI told me my copay was $500, but I could pay $600 in cash. But they charged my insurance company $2,400. So that's really mind-boggling to me, and that's been bothering me for like 5 years, and I just...
Well, Sean, I appreciate you sharing your story. Focusing on this report, Neta Crawford, can you dig in a little bit more to that $350 billion number, medical care for post 9/11 veterans? Does it also include medical care for family members as well?
Well, the TRICARE insurance for active duty soldiers does include their family members. It's a benefit of joining the military. And it's a promise we made to those families, yes. And the veterans care that we look at for the VA numbers is focused on the soldiers themselves, soldiers and sailors.
Eric is next. Compton, California. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, America. Yeah, this is very interesting because, again, the reason we are fighting a war in Afghanistan is because 9/11. But the reason it started because of Saudi Arabia. And even to the fact now we are now supplying Saudi Arabia weapons to go to war in Yemen. This is totally ridiculous when you look at this money being spent, and then we want to talk about the debt and then put it on generations. It's crazy. And us as a people, we at some point in time, we need to yell stop and look at what we're doing.
Neta Crawford, on the costs of the overseas operations, can you break it down by country, at least the major countries and major operations?
Right. Well, yes, I can. The largest portion of spending so far has actually been for Iraq, and that's $822 billion, just looking at the DOD and the State Department spending until recently. Okay, and then Afghanistan actually surpassed Iraq spending recently because it's been a longer and more persistent conflict, and that's $975 billion. And then the war in Syria breaks out to about $54 billion so far.
Monica is a post 9/11 veteran calling from California as well. Monica, go ahead.
Hi, I'm just calling in to say I do agree with the number being much higher than what the Pentagon said, the 1.9, just alone in the veteran health care cost.
Yeah.
I myself receive VA health care, and I mean, it's not the best quality, but I see so many veterans there as well receiving health care or having to use the choice program to go out in town to see doctors when there is over a 30 or 60 day wait, and the cost of that alone adds up. Thank you.
Professor Crawford.
Right. The VA was sort of overwhelmed, I think, at the beginning with the number of veterans that they had to both process in the system, which created a sort of waiting line, and then there's a waiting line for care afterwards. The VA's put enormous resources into both taking care of the computer part of processing individuals through, but also in terms of the human-to-human interaction. And the needs for the VA will increase over the next several decades.
We focused in this Your Money segment on the dollar cost of the wars since 9/11. The Cost of War Project also focuses on the human cost of those wars as well. Want to show some numbers for our viewers. This being tracked, has been tracked as well by the Cost of War Project. U.S. military deaths total approaching 7,000. U.S. contractor deaths approaching 8,000. Some other numbers that you put together: 362 members of the media and journalists killed. National military police from those countries where we've been involved, 109,000 casualties. Somewhere between 109,000 and 114,000 opposition fighters killed since September 11th, 2001, and somewhere between 244,000 and 266,000 civilians. Can you talk about how you track those numbers and how hard that is?
Right. Well, the easiest numbers to track are the numbers of soldiers killed in both war zones, major war zones, and they're also killed in other zones we don't really hear about. But it's easiest to track that because the Department of Defense takes care of that accounting for us. And they're also, if you're interested, they break it down by service and location. Now, in terms of tracking the contractors, that's more difficult. The U.S. contractors are listed on a Department of Labor site, and you can figure out how many they say are killed, but there are many other contractors working for the U.S. Who are killed in these zones, and so we have an estimator for that. Then the civilian number is extremely difficult to get an accurate handle on, but there are several organizations, non-governmental organizations, which try to account for and actually enumerate the civilian death in these war zones. For instance, Iraq Body Count has been looking at the civilian deaths in Iraq. Pakistan Body Count has looked at deaths due to drone strikes in Pakistan. There are a number of human rights organizations following the war in Syria. And so what we do is we look at and there's also the excellent work being done by the United Nations in Afghanistan, investigating individual incidents of civilian harm. So we look at these incidents, these reports, and I actually try to make an assessment about their credibility of the sources, and also track them over time. And by tracking them over time, I can see if the wars are decreasing in intensity for civilians or for soldiers, or they're increasing in intensity. The military is the largest single user of fuel. And I think that if the military reduced its fuel consumption, that is, if we stopped using fuel everywhere all the time to protect us against anything that possibly might happen, we'd actually have a safer United States in the long run.
The project is the Cost of War Project out of Brown University's Watson Institute. If you want to check it out, watson.brown.edu/costs of war. Neta Crawford is the co-director of that project, also a political science professor at Boston University. Appreciate your time this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you.